things which have kind of come from the audience that you want to go and raise repeat?
Yes, I was interested to hear Peter talking about linking in the 1980s with artists and musicians. Could he exemplify that?
Let's see. I mean, for example, when I went to live in Holland, where I lived for 3 years, I had very limited contact with photographers, if any at all. Well, I had one friend who was a photographer. But I do remember going to see, for example, Holland's a great country for galleries, and I used to go to look at paintings a great deal. But in particular, and maybe this is quite understandable, Flemish portrait painting from, like 1450 to about 1525. And I think that there's something that for me at the time, and even now, there's something about the luminosity and clarity, which is almost photographic about a lot of that kind of work, which I found very rewarding. Simultaneously, I used to listen to classical music all the time. I lived in a little wooden house on the edge of a small town, and I remember spending a lot of money I was making washing dishes in a hospital on classical music. So I guess, and I was reading. That was the stage of my life when I was reading something like 100 books a year. I read from 18 to 28. I read about 100 books a year, and then I got to 28, and I started making work quite seriously with a camera. And I've just stopped reading on that scale. And now I'm lucky if I read 1 or 2 books a year, as my wife, who was at the back, will be able to confirm.
So much for Samuel Lerner. Did you regard yourself as chiming in with musicians in the 1980s? And if so, how?
No, not in the sense that I think possibly you might mean. And certainly I had no musical knowledge. I didn't read music or anything like that. But I think probably what was going on was that in the household that I grew up in, my mother was an artistic kind of person. My father was not. He was very uninterested in the arts. My mother painted. She introduced us all to classical music. She sang, actually, semi-professionally. So with her influence, I think an appetite and a sensitivity towards the whole territory of creative work was inculcated from a fairly early age. So I was kind of wide open to it. But I wouldn't want to talk with any authority about music, certainly.
Peter, you were talking about the transition from film to digital.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the other aspects of that transition that inform this body of work. For instance, the ability to look at the photographs you've taken either immediately or that evening, and then perhaps using those photographs as a point of departure for the next work.
Sorry, I missed the last few words.
Well, using the photographs you've just taken to inform the next photograph you've taken.
No, I can see why you asked that question. Actually, there are 50 pictures in the book. There are 27 pictures on display. I took about 1,600 pictures to make this show. And what actually would happen is I would know where I wanted to be very quickly, and then I would make 3 or 4 exposures using the motor drive in case one of them was a bit wobbly or a bit, shaky or whatever, subsequently, or if a file became corrupted, but they would be the same standpoint and the same image, but like 3 or 4 copies. And then I would review it on the back just to check the focus, make sure that the area I wanted to be really sharp was sharp. And then because of the way that the inspiration to make the different images comes, there would be very little connection in formal terms between the photograph I was about to make and maybe one I made earlier in the day. But as for whether or not there would be a relationship between the image I was about to make and one I had made some time ago, that's an entirely different thing. And I think that there is an argument. For example, there's a photograph in the little room here of like these weird red velvet things, and there's a big round ball hanging by a single thread from another red velvet shape. And I've been thinking about that picture, and I've discovered that several pictures through my whole career, in different contexts, have involved something hanging by a single thread or a single piece of string. Even a picture from a series I made called Towards an Absolute Zero, which I showed at the Watershed Gallery in Bristol in 1987. I've been scanning those pictures for the Tate publication, and I found a picture that had exactly the same characteristics. So, in a sense, I can't remember which artist said, I've only ever had one really good idea, but I've stuck to it. In a sense, I wouldn't say that, but I can see recurring preoccupations from even one series to another, which actually, may I say, tend to support my feeling that the energies in the unconscious mind are, coursing backwards and forwards over time, but often the same things are coming up. And I think this really, really is interesting. And I'm sure psychoanalysts will have some serious, fun with that.
Is there any sorry?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about, you mentioned about being in the zone and the idea of subconscious and this subconscious breaking through the conscious mind and taking photos of you in that kind of zone. I was wondering, well, two parts of it. One, in your journey of creating these pictures, did you find there were times when you were more inspired or in the zone? Is there two frames here which are maybe photographed on the same day? And also, does that preoccupy you at all? Is that of any interest to you, or is it more that it happens, so I will click the shutter?
Sorry, can I just be really clear about this? Are you asking me if I take two images on the same day, is that of interest to me?
Well, that's right. If you feel, if there's periods where you feel more in the zone than not, and does that, is that of interest?
There's no question. There are times when I'm more able to be alert to those very, very quiet energies trying to make themselves known than at other times. And it's only of interest in the sense that it's what I would expect. I suppose to more or less a degree, I'm at any given moment when I'm working seriously capable of keeping those everyday conscious, if you like, mind preoccupations at a distance, or they're coming closer. And I think the further away they are, then the greater the space for energy from. And I would like to try and make this difference between the subconscious and the conscious mind. I did have to look this up recently. And apparently, if you look it up, as I did, you find that the subconscious mind is considered to have preoccupations that with a little bit of will or application with the conscious mind we can access relatively easily, whereas the unconscious mind is considered to be territory that we do not have any direct control over, willful control over accessing, and therefore that's what makes that territory, the unconscious mind, so fascinating for me, precisely because I don't have any conscious control over accessing it. That makes it a lot more mysterious and exciting and slightly terrifying.
But if it can't be known, Peter, how can you be possibly interested in it?
Well, it's not a question of it not being known or it not being able to be known for me. I guess in a sense, I think what all creative people do, serious creative people do, is they find a way from experience and with determination perhaps and a tremendous amount of energy application, they find a way to, if you like, encourage themselves to pay attention to those moments when that energy is coming up towards the conscious mind, and they just try to sort of help it on its way, and then when it's come up into the conscious mind, that's when the conscious mind can deal with it. But it's a very fragile thing. It's a really fragile thing.
It's a colourful analogy.
Sorry?
It's a colourful analogy.
But not very satisfactory?
It doesn't quite chime in with me.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. I'm just giving you my view. Hi.
Hi there. As a sculptor, I'm really interested in why you're taking, the way you're taking pictures of the objects you're taking, and whether you're making differences, conscious choices about whether you're taking pictures about the substance of an object or about how recognisable it is. So I'm just wondering about the interplay between those two. And also you talked a lot about sort of getting this close and the importance of small things. And I was just wondering if there's a point at which you stop and you think, oh, I can't get any closer to this because it's going to turn maybe abstract, or I'm going to lose something here about the recognizability of where I am, or something.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
Well, for the first part of your question, I think I'd probably refer you to what I was talking about earlier, with this whole thing of the picture of the armour, illustrations in the book. And, you know, it may seem incredible that I was sort of really shocked to have it pointed out that it was a book of armour illustrations. I mean, on one level, that's like childlike stupidity and ridiculousness on my part. I mean, how is that possible? But I think it is possible because of the way that I'm reading the work, and I'm reading the work in a way that relates to how I'm reading the subject and the objects when I'm standing in front of them. So, in connection with the second part of, I think, your question was, getting too close is not something that I'm ever particularly aware of, because there's something about the right position at which this emotional experience, in a way what I'm doing is I'm photographing how I feel, not how the subject looks. And the subjects look the way they look because of the way I'm feeling. And I think for me this is really, really critically important. It's something I've always done. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm also thinking back to the issue, because I saw the show you did, the Deep Blue show.
Oh, did you?
Way back at the Cambridge Dark Room.
Oh, really?
Sadly, not in the gallery, but
Okay.
and the materials which the objects you were taking pictures of there, some supercomputers and satellites, incredibly rarefied kind of titanium alloys and beautiful metals, very precious.
Yeah.
And things which you don't see every day.
Sure.
And to me, they spoke more of kind of getting into the substance of something rather than its sort of importance to your everyday mind, as it were. I don't, and by everyday mind, I mean, you know, the object you see around domestically.
Well,
I don't know where I'm going with this.
Well, I mean, what I would say is that Deep Blue was a completely different way of approaching making work.
Right, okay.
You know,
So it's changed.
I was thinking, Deep Blue came out of my preoccupation with what was happening with Garry Kasparov and IBM and the computers they were designing, and you know, deep interest in chess, and also 2001, which Kubrick's film, which some people here, many people here have probably seen. And there's this amazing moment in that movie where HAL, the mainframe computer, with its eye, is watching two of the astronauts through a portal plotting against the mission because they reckon HAL's gone a bit, wacko. And at that point, when in fact, HAL, you know HAL was taken badly when he starts killing off some of the astronauts in long-term, suspended animation, going against Asimov's first law of robotics, which is the machine shall not harm human being. But I didn't find that difficult to really come to get to grips with it. So I wanted to make portraits of machines, and to try to make portraits of machines in the highest technology places in the world in 1995, 6 or 7. And you're living in a studio in Hackney, and you don't have a computer because none of us have computers in 1997, but you have a fax machine, and you've got some fax numbers of scientists around the world because you've been to the library. It's a very, very different way of approaching making that work. And then, you go to NASA at Houston, you've got 4 hours, and you've got 2 security people, and you've got to make a picture. That's a very different way of working. It's going to have a very different feel, and the purpose of the work, to propose, again, this is a very important word for me, that we think about the emergence of a new class with possibly sociological implications, because portraiture traditionally has been used, it seems to me anyway, to either document an emerging social class or an established social class. I'm happy to be corrected by people who are more familiar with portraiture than I am, but I mean, that was the fundamental idea behind that work. And, it says something that I went to about 60 different scientific sites around the world, and there are 11 images in the final edited selection. I'm not quite sure, but that was the right number. but I didn't realise it when I kept going to this country, this scientific research establishment, and so on. So, kind of a quirky body of work in overall my history, but not really when you think about the fact that I went to study civil engineering when I first left college. School, sorry. It's so funny, I went to see the school's career officer in 1970, whatever, 1969, and the guy said, we've already got one David Bailey, we don't need two. And I said I'd like to be a photographer. So I went to study civil engineering, you know, and it was an absolute disaster. And I lasted 3 months, and I just waited until the beginning of the next academic year when I went to Manchester and I met people like Martin Forrest, or a friend of mine. Is that more information than that?
No, it's quite about dates, mate. Just here.
So, last week I read about the urban explorers, maybe some of us read as well, you know, where are people that sort of go into places, cavities, you know, that are not very open.
Like underground stuff?
Yeah, and what struck me is, one of them actually took it seriously, he wrote a whole PhD thesis on it, and he sort of based it on the same book. I'd already seen this, and I thought it was interesting link of how, you know, you've created a sort of subconscious view of London, whereas it's really sort of subterranean, but, you know, the idea, the inspiration came from the same source.
I suppose there's a whole kind of book or a show that could be put together from work sort of all being inspired by it.
And I thought it was interesting, it was, you know, it's both London.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, you're right. This is very unpredictable. So it's based on virtually everything I've seen is very architectural, and it's physical cities in some form, buildings, where this just does leave a space between the book, and in one sense it connects more to the book than most of the other kind of artistic projects, because it leaves
so much to the imagination.
Yeah, so, you know, this is subconscious, that's just subterranean.
No, I see why I'm using some, but actually, of course, I've made the point that for me it's the unconscious rather than subconscious. But I take the point.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in your views on this kind of expanded arena which you may now be accepted and perceived in as a consequence of being included and reference to other artists, British artists. I'm wondering if there's ever a kind of a situation or a feel where you consider that you may be perceived as being, in some strange respect, kind of traitor towards photography because you're actually using photography in service to art, in the way that artists used photography in the 60s, particularly, the minimalists and so forth. Is there still any sense within your kind of activity that you perceive yourself as a photographer for them as opposed to an artist?
Oh yeah, I am a photographer.
Does that?
Well, I think we need to get this really straight. When, you know, for about 15 years, from probably the late 80s, I insisted on calling myself an artist. Over and over and over again, in such a tedious and tiresome way. And part of the reason, of course, was because the position of intelligent photography in this country was such that the tape director, Alan Boness, actually said in print, when Keith Arnott stopped being a conceptual artist who had been shown around the world, had a very high profile, had work in the tape, had photographs of his performances in the tapes. But after he had met David Hearn down in Newport as a lecturer, and he'd gone up to David Hearn, he'd been so excited, if you like, by pure photography or documentary photography, and he asked David Hearn, will you teach me photography? I want to become a photographer. And then he worked really, really hard on some fairly eccentric series of people with their dogs and so on, but rather lovely and very pure in a photographic sense. And Alan Boness refused to buy any of his new photographs, and he was in print as saying, the Tate does not buy photographs by photographers, only by artists. And that really clarified the situation that a number of people, and I was one of many, who were trying to fight and combat and address when we were insisting in those days on calling ourselves artists. But Wolfgang Tillmans, who was for a short time a student of mine, as you know, won the Turner Prize for his photography in, I forget, 92, it was quite a while ago. I think that was the moment when we all realised the game was up, photography is being taken really seriously. And it wasn't long after when I just stopped calling myself an artist and called myself a photographer, and have done so for the last 15 years or 18 years or whatever it is. And that's my position. If you go to my website, it'll say Peter Fraser, photographer. So I'm not making, I'm not making photographs and arguing that they should be considered to be art, but there seems to be a context which is very happy with my work, and there are other contexts which are very unhappy with my work as photographs. So what do? I mean, you want to work with people who want to work with you.
So the small big question, why photography, or what's your personal reason or connection to the medium and the apparatus to continue using that?
Can you put that another way, please?
Why do you have a camera when you want to make a piece of work?
Oh, well, I got my first camera when I was 7, and I loved the whole thing of looking at the world through a viewfinder. I was one of those schoolboys who was always looking out the window and lining things up and seeing faces in the clouds, and there was never any question. I mean, it wasn't even a conscious decision. I was in the school darker when I was 9 or 10 or 11 or whatever. Experiencing that phenomenal magic, which is still exciting to remember, of seeing the print up in the developer and so on. And also having a real feel for technical things and beautifully made things like cameras. There was never going to be anything else. I'm really sorry it's so straightforward. Well, it is for me anyway.
Recently you've printed everything exactly the same size and sort of had a sort of degree of uniformity throughout the whole.
Yeah, I wanted them all to be the same size uniform.
But I mean,
That's one of those questions that's really...
do you ever sort of, for me...
Change the scale and...
Changing the scale, having some very small things, very small, some very...
You mean like Wolfgang?
No, not Wolfgang. He was a student.
I just wanted to kind of make all the work the same size, and I tend to make a series. And I think you have to have a very good reason for changing the scale within the series, because you change the emphasis in very particular ways. And sometimes there can be a hierarchical relationship between large and small images, which could be very appropriate, but for the way I work, it would be inappropriate. And also, this was an experiment. I had a studio in Hackney for 18 years, and when I started working with the computer was at home, and I realised that I was going less and less, so I got rid of the studio, and I started working all the time at home. My wife's very understanding, and 1/3 of our lounge is a digital printing studio, and my machine prints, this size, and the rest just kind of follow.
So these are all printed at home?
Yeah, absolutely. I recommend it. Well, especially because you have incredible control over the final result. I do when I make larger work, and I have made very large work as an artist in residence at Oxford University between 2006 and 2008. And the university bought gigantic work to put in this new biochemistry building, like a diptych that was 24 feet wide. And I really wanted to get away from, I wanted to get right back down much closer to what we might consider a more traditional photographic scale, which again is part of this excitement, enthusiasm, being a photographer. I feel really proud to be a photographer.
The show is called Sitting Mind, and I think it's a brilliant title. What I don't quite understand is why it's important to know these photographs are taken in London.
Well, that's a very good question. For me, it was very important, certainly, to constrain myself and to exercise that level of self-discipline. But in a sense, I suppose, for me, there is an interesting tension. Someone said to me, there's no tension in that. But for me, there is an interesting tension in the idea that all of these photographs required a physical subject in order to be made, but collectively, together, they suggest, especially in the book as well as the show, a city that we can't, none of us, even I can't visit physically now, but only in the imagination. And I think my answer is really tied up with that for me it makes a lot of sense that all the work was made geographically in a physical space, but the consequence of that creative effort is that we can't physically visit the city that I'm proposing to you. And for me, there's more conceptual energy involved with that, knowing that all the works were made in London. If I'd made pictures all around the world and I'd set a city in mind, for me that's just not hanging together. Okay.
That was a very good question and a very good answer. I'm just thinking of Freud and the portable camera. Because when Freud's major texts were being written, this coincided with the invention and development of the 35mm camera. The idea that the camera could be in your hands and you could move around, and it was the beginning of what was called photojournalism. The idea that you could take photographs of people not being aware that you need a photograph. So that, I'm just thinking there is a connection to the camera you're using and its history and to Freud. In the sense you can maybe not take photographs of people, but you can on moments where both the subject and the photographer could be in a different position.
Yeah.
Be not engaging directly with the subject, but being unconscious of what we're taking.
Yes, I think it's a really good point, and I would simply add this last rider, that when I'm making work, it all goes back to this experience in Manchester, and it's still active, and it's been active all the way through my career. When I was a student, and I lived in a house in South Manchester, it's a Sunday morning, I was working with 5.4 camera, a windy day, and I was trying to photograph these hostel leaves. It had been raining and raindrops that were sticking on the leaves, and it was very, very appealing. But my exposure meter said it was a 20-second exposure, and the wind was kind of going. I wasted 4 or 5 sheets of film, and then I must have entered some strange kind of reverie when I kind of sensed that there was going to be a period of stillness longer than 20 seconds, and I waited for this to begin. And I pressed the shutter release, I run this cable things. There were 20 seconds of stillness, but when the shutter opened, it seemed to me that every aeroplane on every single flight path around the world stopped mid-flight, and they stayed like that until the shutter closed again. Then they carried on their flight paths. And in a sense, for me, this is all tied up with, one, I'm making work. There is no past and there is no future. There is only the present. And I think if there is intensity in the work, it's tied up with that kind of modus operandi.
And it connects to the idea of the machine, and the intelligent machine. The machine is talking to the machine.
Absolutely right.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.